Mental health effects of growing up queer. See, I'm a queer atheist who was born and raised in various parts of Texas, not called Austin. Essentially, I've actually said those two sentences 4 times on stage now. And there's actually a bit of it's a trick I do. It's actually a narrative trick. So I'm actually kind of telling you all for the first time that I actually do this. Well, first of all, so I'm actually pretty dismissive in both sentences. So the first one, I'm like, Twitter, GitHub, all those other places. I get a little laugh, and I say, queer atheists in Texas, and places in Texas not called Austin, right? Kind of jokey. And I do the second one mostly to kind of like capture attention, to kind of shock people a little bit and sort of focus things a little bit, but without being too on the nose about it. But it's a narrative trick I do. And I don't know, I've been doing it for a long time, and I've just been thinking about like the narrative of talks and things like that a lot, and whoa, that's upside down. And I don't know, I think it's ultimately a kind of defensive technique. Like I'm actually really bad about using humor to diffuse tension, about being really dismissive. And that kind of comes from growing up. The other thing though that I said though, a queer atheist born in Texas, like it's not exactly accurate. Like now every single word I said is actually true. Like I was born in Houston, Texas in 1982. So by the way, I'm actually older than I look. I'm actually technically a Gen Xer according to most definitions, although not all. But I left there when we were 3, and I lived in a small town in New Mexico, 5,000 people called Truth or Consequences. I moved away from there when I was 7. So like I remember that place, but I was a kid. And the thing about like queerness that's really different than I think a lot of other marginalizations is it's something that's not apparent at birth. We don't come and realize that we're queer, typically until puberty. Sometimes even much later after that. And so there's this dynamic that tends to happen, especially if you grow up in a conservative place like I did, where we learn about the culture, we learn from the culture, the cultural views on queerness before we realize that we're queer ourselves. So oftentimes we'll pick up homophobia even though we're queer. And we don't realize that until after the fact. And so this is what we talk about when we say internalized homophobia. And that by the time we realize we're queer, we've already internalized that. Or we already are homophobic. But then we realize there's this cognitive dissonance, and we can't just stop doing that, right? We can't change the way we've been programmed, so we turn it inward. In some cases, this looks a lot like hate. You think of like Westboro Baptist Church, things like that. And so yeah, a lot of people turn that inwards, and so it turns into self-loathing. That actually wasn't me though. And Texas is a strange place. So when I was 7, we moved to Denton, Texas. We say it Denton, we leave the T off, and it's like this sort of weird accent thing, that's just the accent. But if you spell it, it says Denton. Interesting quick little side note about this, by the way. If you've ever read the book, So You Want to Talk About Race? The author, she's 2 years older than me, born and raised in Denton. I think we actually might have gone to the same high school, although I'm not certain. So Denton is a weird place. And there were some things actually in that book where I was like, I know exactly what she's talking about. I know exactly the person that she's talking about when she described her mom, because I was living there. Like, I know that society really well. And Denton is an especially strange place even for Texas, in that there's a university there, the University of North Texas. And one of the things they're known for is they have the 2nd best jazz program in the nation. Who knew, right? Well, actually my parents did, because that's why we went there. Both my parents are middle school music teachers, and my dad wanted to become a composer. So he went back to school. Now, as you can imagine, having only one parent working in their middle school music teacher, not a lot of money, and just couldn't support it, so my dad wasn't able to finish. Oh, and by the way, for the record, my parents are actually the most financially well off in my family. So I didn't come from money. So back to Denton though, there's this small liberal artistic core to it. But it's also the northern part of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, which means that it is basically surrounded by farmland all around it. And so in the city itself, you had these 2 different sides that didn't exactly get along. Now, Texas is kinda part of the South, kinda not. It's like both. So it takes a lot from the South, but you also get a little bit of Midwest niceness. And so one of the big things that this means is that when you're in Texas, you don't talk about anything uncomfortable. Like, that is the culture. You don't bring up issues that make people feel uncomfortable. And of course, when we say people, we really mean the people in power, which is cis straight white folks. Now you have this especially, that means people just never talked about anything controversial, including queerness. And I'm just old enough that there was no representation in media at all. Will and Grace came on the air towards the end of high school. Queer Eye didn't come on until I was already in college. And social networks wouldn't exist for almost I think a decade or more after I became a preteen. So when I'm starting to go through this, when I start hitting puberty, I had no idea what the fuck was going on, basically. Especially because I'm bisexual, which means I'm attracted to people of all genders. And by the way, that whole transphobic bi thing, that's bullshit. Bi basically means attracted to people of the same gender and different genders, and that is absolutely me. But growing up, I knew I was attracted to women. And there was a little bit of discussion on every once in a while you would just kind of see something slip through. Sort of through this, we don't talk about anything controversial, but on occasion it would happen, and it was more the typical thing you would expect, talking about how gay people are evil, going to hell. But the thing is, I knew I wasn't gay. No one ever talked about bisexual. I literally didn't learn what bisexual was, even though I am bisexual, until my junior year in high school kind of thing, well after I had started puberty. But the other thing about this though is I knew I was different somehow. And not necessarily because of anything of myself. I'm myself, right? There's nothing weird about us. We're people, we're ourselves. But everyone else knew I was different. And I could feel that. And I didn't know what it was, but it's whenever there's an awkward moment in a room, there's something going on. You don't know what it is, but you can feel that elephant in the room, that tension between others. I felt that directed towards me, but no one told me what it was. So, I was mostly just confused, especially I was confused why I was always othered. And this isn't just that teenage angsty, no one gets me. I could tell that adults thought that I was different and that they were treating me differently. Once again, I didn't know why. And so, I don't know, I self-isolated a lot on this. Because other people were treating me differently. I didn't know why, I didn't know what to do about it. So I just kind of withdrew. I had no friends pretty much growing up. I had literally one friend in all of high school kind of thing. And I didn't know. I really didn't know. And the thing about this culture that, this probably, if you're not from the South, this may sound weird. You're well, this is not what I was expecting. And this is the thing about the South, is that bigotry in the South does not look like what liberals on the West Coast and the Northeast think it does. Not at all. There's this image of in your heads that racism, homophobia, whatever, it looks like, KKK members burning crosses, or the Westboro Baptist Church, marching and picketing signs. And that's not what it looks like. That is such a tiny, tiny sliver of it. And this gets especially problematic here because, oftentimes liberals, especially white liberals, will hold up this caricature, and it is an absolute caricature, and say well, I'm not like this, therefore I can't be racist. Right, but the truth is I've lived in both places for a while now. I've been in the Bay Area almost a decade. Racism here looks almost identical to racism in the South. Some differences, of course, but they're really not that different at all. And this frustrates me to no end because I see people scapegoating the South all the time, really just to excuse shitty behavior here. And I am fucking sick and tired of it at this point. Because especially anytime I call it out, I get the brunt end of this. I actually had a white guy I was talking to, super social justice activist type. I called him out on some of this and had a conversation with this. Yeah, he called me a Nazi and blocked me on all of social media. That was fun. But it kind of comes back to this. It's people don't know what this actually looks like. And I don't think folks here want to know. They really don't want to know because then that means they have to do work, even though And seriously, look at the history of this place. The history of the Bay Area is fucked up. Oh my God. So I don't know, going back to my story though, in some ways this made it even harder going because I didn't know what was going on. I actually kind of wish that there were people protesting in the streets, because at least then I could be oh, okay, this is what I am, and fuck you. I couldn't even do that, right? All I was left knowing is, okay, there's something going on, I don't know, I'm just gonna back away, I'm gonna make myself small. Like, I did that a lot. Like, I have all kinds of defense mechanisms from this that are fucked up. Like, anyone who's worked for me, or like worked with me on anything, and you come and say, hey, sorry, I can't do this thing, notice how many times I say the phrase, no worries. When I say that, that is a defense mechanism. Like, just, I'm telling you right now, I guess, accountability or something. I do this all the time. Like, I don't, and I'll call out shitty people being shitty on their shitty behavior. Like, I'm somehow not afraid to do that, but if it's actually like I care about a person and they're not being super shitty, I don't ever push back. I always am just like, I'll just take on whatever the situation is, because that's what I've always done. Yeah. And like, because growing up, this was basically, I realize now, I know now, that essentially what was going on is that, like, growing up, homophobia to me wasn't violence, it was gaslighting. That's what it was. And it's just as serious. You know, we all think that racism, homophobia, sexism, like all that, we always think that it looks like violence. And sometimes it does. Don't get me wrong, it absolutely is violent sometimes, but that's not all it is. And if we say that it's just violence, we're missing all of the other dangerous ways that it fucks people up. Because that's not what I experienced, for the most part. There was one guy, and the thing about this is, like, I think a lot of people actually did, you know, could sense things in me. Other folks I think knew I was queer before I did. And like, yeah, I actually do remember one guy who basically threatened to beat me up pretty much every single day, and I actually was terrified going into the class I had with him, because I always had to be on guard. He was much, much bigger than me, and he absolutely could. And of course the teachers wouldn't do anything about it. But like, aside from that, I can't remember any like physical threats. It was more of distance and alienation and this sort of subtle implied threat of what I didn't know, but it was always there and I felt it. And I was afraid because of it a lot of the time. But especially whenever, like, on those occasions something would come through in the news. Like, I still remember when Matthew Shepard was tortured and murdered for being gay. And I was in high school then. And like, I mean, once again, I knew I wasn't gay, but I knew that that scared me. That it got under my skin and I was just really afraid from that. And I mean, in some ways I still am. In a lot of ways I still am. Because you know, queerness it's such an odd thing whenever we talk about a lot of this, because once again, we're not born knowing this. And it also means growing up, we don't have parents who can help us navigate this, right? And not to say that this makes it worse than any others. I'm not trying to do a comparative of any sort of, I fucking hate oppression Olympics, by the way. I'm just saying that this is something that is somewhat unique, I think, to queerness. And that I had no one to lead me through figuring any of this out. I had to figure out everything on my own. And especially because, like, they don't teach us any of this in school. Like, there was never a single mention of sexual orientation in sex ed, and health, and physiology, and social studies, and history. Like, I had to learn queer history on my own afterwards, because it just was not taught at all. And there was no one to lead me. I had no role models, no one to teach me, no one to say, like, this is how you navigate the world as a queer person. Like, imagine everyone having to learn it for the first time on their own and no one to teach them. Like, that's what queerness is, honestly. And so, yeah, go figure. I'm really fucking anxious. I deal with a lot of anxiety. And I'm usually pretty good at hiding it, not always. I notice I'm pretty fidgety right now, actually. But I'm always anxious. Sometimes it's just a low hum in the background. Something that just, you know, kind of keeps me a little more alert than I would be otherwise. And that I can deal with. That's no problem. Sometimes it's worse. I would say probably on average about once a month it gets bad enough that I can't work. Like, I'm not able to focus on anything. And, you know, fortunately, going back to Jenna's talk, working from home is really important for mental health. Like, this helps me out significantly. Although when I'm in this state, like, if you actually look at me, I'm literally pacing around my apartment. I can't sit, I can't think. Sometimes I can't talk even, or have a really coherent conversation. I mean, thankfully that's really rare. That's just a couple times a year, but it happens. Actually, the most recent time, and it wasn't quite this bad, the most recent time I had a really bad anxiety spell was just last week. There was a bunch of stuff that went into it. It actually had nothing to do with this conference, but it got in my way of being able to do things I needed to do for this. And I mean, I thank Kim a lot for really just stepping in and just being like, I got this. But it gets in the way of work and it gets in the way of relationships. And especially growing up, being so isolated the way I was, it made me afraid of relationships. And I'm actually still not very good at it. I'm terrible at keeping in touch with people. Like if I don't see someone in person, I basically don't reach out to them, ever. And that fucking sucks. It really fucking sucks. And like, I don't know though, like the other part of it though is every once in a while, it's rare, a couple of times a year maybe, but like every once in a while my anxiety actually does completely stop and go away. And like, for this brief moment, I get a glimpse of who I would be otherwise. Like I see the person I would be if I wasn't anxious. And I know that my anxiety comes from my queerness and growing up. Like those two are intrinsically linked and probably always will be. But like I get this brief look into what calm Bryan looks like, and it's amazing and sad all at the same time. Like that person is kind of one of my favorite people. I wish I could see him more. But it's just not the way my brain works. And like the other thing about anxiety, especially when it relates to, queer folks and really any marginalized group, is that like growing up, I've always been anxious. I see that now anyways, like retrospectively I can see that, but I didn't actually know that until a little more than a year ago. Like I've only been in therapy about a little less than a year at this point. It took me that long to figure it out. Because anxiety isn't this pure thing that exists crystalline in a vacuum somewhere. It's always interrelated with everything else we have going on. And when you're a marginalized person, especially, or in which I will say queerness in Texas back then it's not anymore, especially here, I think that's complicated. Suffice it to say though, I grew up with real threat. And so whenever you're experiencing this, of course you're going to be anxious. And being able to separate out, I'm anxious because of what society is doing to me versus I'm anxious because I'm actually dealing with mental illness, those things can be almost impossible to separate, especially when you're a fucking kid. So like I didn't learn this for so long because I could point and be like, oh, well, of course I'm feeling anxious right now because blah, and X is a valid reason to be anxious. It took me forever to like separate these two. And like the statistics bear this out. This isn't just an anecdote, by the way. If you look at the rates of mental illness among queer people in general, they are quite a bit higher than the public at large. And I've heard similar things for other marginalized groups too. Rates of PTSD among people of color, especially African Americans in this country, is quite a bit higher. And for bi folks specifically, like there's this added thing being bi in that I'm not really accepted by the straight world. I definitely don't fit in the straight world, my God. But also, like gay and lesbian folks tend to reject bi folks too. Like we're kind of hated on both sides. And the statistics bear that out. The rates of mental health among bisexual people are double that of gay and lesbian folks. And the rates, and by the way, I'll also add though, to take it a notch further, is when we talk about the trans community, the rates of mental illness in the trans community are a lot higher than they are with bi folks. And this purely comes from how we're treated and from what society does to us. Like, this isn't genetics or anything like that. This is pure culture and oppression, honestly, that causes it. And so I came out here, I moved out here 9 years ago. And I did that to escape Texas, just straight up, I did it to escape Texas. I had to just get away. I couldn't be in Texas anymore. And so I came to San Francisco, I'm like, San Francisco, queer capital of the world, this is gonna be great, even though I actually didn't quite realize I was queer then. I didn't come out until, I think, 3 years ago. But I was like, San Francisco, this is gonna fix everything. It's gonna be so much better here. It's such a diverse and inclusive and welcoming place, and holy fuck was I surprised. And it took me a long time to figure this out. It took me years to figure out just honestly how fucked up and neurotic the Bay Area is. Like you were saying earlier, you're spot on. This place is fucking neurotic. And it took me forever to realize this, and I learned it through some very hard lessons too. I still see it socially, and like we talk about how San Francisco is the queer capital of the world. We're not just queer accepting. This is where you get to come and flourish and be yourself. And I learned that's not exactly true. We can get here and flourish. If we're out, in the gay pride parade. If we're on TV, that's great, sure. If we're hanging out with friends, yeah, come be queer. Wear your bisexual pride shirt, for example. And this is awesome. Oh, but as soon as you want to criticize the straight folks around you here for not being super inclusive, oh no, that's off the table. Can't do that. So the way this hit home the most for me, though, was with my former social group. And I say former for a reason. My core friend group up until last year was exactly this. I wasn't the only queer person in this group, and I actually kind of worry about how some of them are doing now. But it was mostly straight. It was incredibly heteronormative, and it was incredibly patriarchal. So when we say heteronormative, if you haven't heard that term before, it means like everyone may not necessarily be straight, but straightness is the way that culture acts, and straightness is the primary power structure. And heteronormativity and patriarchy are very closely intertwined, by the way. They're similar, different, but they are very related. And that was this group. And I had a great time with them for a long time. I got my first real friends out here. I had the biggest friend group I'd ever had. I was like, oh my gosh, I have friends. This is amazing. And then I started noticing a few issues. And then I eventually started calling things out. And oh my God, did the shit hit the fan there. Like, as soon as this started happening, they started distancing themselves. And honestly, I felt like I was back in Texas again. I felt like I was back in that fucked up social situation I was in high school. Here, in San Francisco. And so I don't know if I would say I was forced out of that group or if I left for my own social sanity, but that's what happened. And so I found myself having to rebuild my social circle all over again out here. And like, this is what's so fucked up about oppression is that most of the time it doesn't look like violence. Most of the time it's not overt. Sometimes it is, but that's not the majority of it. And that's, I think, the main reason it persists is because it's subtle and it's not obvious, but it's here. One of the best examples I think I saw of this, though, was a little over 2 years ago now, with the Pulse shooting in Orlando, when someone went into a gay nightclub and killed 49 people. At the time, it was the biggest mass shooting in the US. And not surprisingly, me and everyone else in the queer community, we were just devastated. And I'm working remotely, hop on our Skype call for our morning stand-up Monday morning, and I'm the only queer person on this team, by the way. And everyone's just like laughing and joking, like, oh, how's your weekend? And just oblivious. And like, I'm so wrecked, I couldn't speak. Like, I could not vocalize words at this point. And I think I'm like made up some excuse, mic's not working, so I could only type in the window, and even then only barely. Eventually I was able to get myself together enough to talk to my manager and be like, I can't work right now. But that was just a reminder again of how isolating this experience can be, and just how much people don't actually care or pay attention when they're in a power structure, even in an incredibly liberal place like San Francisco. And and there's other things that worry me about this too. Like this, we tend to think of civil rights, we tend to think of queer rights, all of these social justice movements as always improving, as like a linear line, or at least always going up. And that's just not true. Like, once again, we need to study history. It is so fucking important that we study history. Because we go back in time about 85 years, let's say. Guess where the safest place and the most accepting place for queer folks was in the entire world? 85 years ago. And there was a place, by the way, where it was actually safe to be out, and it was actually relatively accepted. It was kind of queer Mecca. Berlin, fucking Germany. Right as Hitler was coming to power, Berlin was the safest place for queer people to be. 10 years later, fuck no, because we were getting thrown into the concentration camps right alongside Jews, except we were wearing a pink triangle instead of a yellow star. This shit can change and backslide so goddamn fast. And we have to be so careful of it. And it's not lost on me, by the way, that San Francisco is the queer capital of the world right now, and we just elected a fascist as president. Right? Now, I do think it's different, and ultimately, like we've been talking, I am hopeful that it actually is going to be really different this time, and that people are waking up because of it. The internet is changing that dynamic, but still, there's that part of me that is just really fucking scared about that. And just learning this, figuring out how to navigate this, organizing as a group. Like, we do organize pretty well in the queer community, but it's not perfect. It's like, how do we get everyone on board, especially? And like, how do we protect queer people across this country? Like, especially when we're not even that great here. Like, I remember I was at a conference in the South not too terribly long ago, and I was chatting with this one guy, really young, just out of college, definitely queer, pretty cute. And we had a bit of a flirty vibe going on, a little young for my taste, but he had just moved here, actually. We had to go back to the South, back to his hometown to meet, but he had moved to the Castro like a couple months prior. And like he was talking about moving here, and I saw so much of myself in him. Like, he moved here, I could tell he moved here to escape. And he talked about it in jokey, laughy, dismissive ways, the same defense mechanisms I have, but he hadn't really learned yet. Like, when he talked about how it was so awesome being in San Francisco, I knew what he meant in that he felt safe being here. And like, I knew that wasn't true, but I actually couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. Like, I feel like I kind of needed to be like, hey, you've got to know some things, and I couldn't do it, actually. I couldn't shatter him like that. And I still kind of think about that, because like, it goes back to what's the responsibility, what's the right thing to do, how do we protect our communities, but also how do we support each other, and like when these things come into conflict, and I don't actually have a point to that, but it's just something that kind of keeps on my mind. And like, I actually don't have an ending to this talk, by the way. I actually really don't. Public speaking is a thing that I'm really into, and I care a lot about sort of the art of public speaking and how we phrase this. And there's a lot of tricks that I can pull out. Just that's the thing that comes with experience. And I structure a lot of my cultural talks in a very specific way. I start with the intro that I had at the beginning, and I always end with a call to action. But I don't have a call to action this time, because I don't have an ending to this, because I don't have an ending to my story yet. I still deal with anxiety all the fucking time. I'm still sorting through that. Thank God I have a queer therapist, by the way, because she actually gets it. But it's, the thing I've learned is there's not fixing this. It's just managing for the rest of my life. And the fact that I have to do this because of what society did to me, that can be kind of hard to take sometimes. I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know where it's going to go from here. I don't know what the future will look like. I mean, I think I'll get better. I'll be able to learn to manage it better. But it's still like there's some version of me in some alternate reality that doesn't have to deal with this because I didn't have to deal with this, but that's not this reality. And in a lot of ways, I think it's kind of, I guess too late for me. I don't know if that's the right saying, but that's why I'm an activist, I think, because I'm not going to be able to really fix this. I'm not going to be able to fix my head. But if we do enough, maybe we can fix it for the future. And I think that's one of my big drivers in all of this. But I don't know. I don't have a call to action. I actually don't have I can't say, go do this thing and that will make it better, because I don't actually know what that is. Because what happened in the past can never be fixed. There is no amount of apologizing or making up that can make up for past wrongs, for past atrocities. There's just, yeah. And so that's why I don't have an ending for this. And I guess I'll just stop.